Hi class, I hope you're having a great day. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 9, Section 1, Washington's Presidency. So before we learn that a new constitution approved in 1788 served as a guide for the new Republican government, and we're going to look at today, George Washington and his advisors faced many challenges during his presidency. So the key question, how did Washington's presidency shape new political traditions? With the Constitution approved, a president needed to be elected, and the first electoral college elected, who was it? George Washington, our first president under the Constitution. So George Washington was inaugurated, formally sworn in, on April 30th, 1789 at the nation's capital in New York City. Notice the capital is in New York City, not Washington, D.C. It is then moved to Philadelphia and then Washington, D.C. The presidential runner-up was John Adams, who became the first vice president. Washington knew his actions would set precedent, an example that becomes standard practice. So he knew that he was, in a way, setting a legacy, that what he did, presidents after him would follow. So he had a big role. Here's our Vice President, John Adams. Something I want to just go over again are branches of government. When the when the Congress got together and talked about, the branches of government, how it's going to work. We have the executive branch, which is the president, the legislative branch, which is Congress, which is broken into the House of Representatives and the Senate, and then we have the judicial, which is the Supreme Court. The first Congress. So we're just looking at the legislative branch now. Congress, which is made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives, met for the first time in April of 1789. The senators, the upper house, wore wigs, lace, and velvet. The Senate was small. There was only 2 members from each state. They were quiet and proper. The first 5 years, the sessions were private, but in 1794, a gallery was built for the public and press. The House of Representatives, on the other hand, was more informal, welcoming the public and the press from the onset, the beginning, and members from the House were loud and even wore hats inside the chamber. Now, no one knew if the government based on the will of the people could actually work. And one of the first things Congress talked about is, what should we call the president? And John Adams was the head of the Senate, and he goes on and on about what we should call the president. And the senators were just getting tired of hearing this over and over and over again. But some of the things that they thought about calling him was His Excellency. They thought that was too king-like. Another one, His Highness the President of the United States of America and Protector of their Liberties. A mouthful. And the winner was President of the United States, or simply Mr. President. So now looking at the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, the Constitution created the Supreme Court, but it left the details to the new Congress. So they had questions like, well, what type of additional courts should there be and how many? And what if a federal court decision conflicts with a state law? So they decided to pass the Federal Judiciary Act of 1789, which gave the Supreme Court 6 members. You have a Chief Justice, and Justice is a judge, and 5 Associate Justices, or judges. It allowed states to keep their own court system, but also added federal courts in each state. And we still have this today. Just to note, today we have 9 justices on the Supreme Court, but back then it was 6. So President Washington appointed John Jay as the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So now the Constitution gave Congress the task of developing departments to help the president lead the nation. So Washington picks talented people to head these different departments, and this was known as the president's cabinet. People to advise him on official matters. So you can take a look at this description here. The Secretary of State is in charge of foreign affairs. Washington chose Thomas Jefferson. The Secretary of Treasury to handle the nation's economy and the finances. He chose Alexander Hamilton. The Secretary of War in charge of nation's defense, he chose Henry Knox. And the Attorney General to handle the government's legal matters, he chose Edmund Randolph. So Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of Treasury, was assigned by President Washington to straighten out the country's finances. Because of the Revolutionary War, we were in a ton of debt. We borrowed money from France, Spain, and the Netherlands. We owed soldiers money for serving in the military. States had their own debt too. Individual states borrowed money. So the U.S. debt was over $52 million. Hamilton wanted to pay off these debts to show that the U.S. was responsible about money and believed that if we paid off our debts, other countries would take us more seriously and know that they could do business with us. Hamilton also wanted a strong national government. He wanted the federal government to be stronger than the states. He also believed the government should encourage business and industry, and the nation's prosperity depended on the support of the nation's wealthy merchants and manufacturers. The government owed such men money, and Hamilton wanted to pay them back to get their support. So Hamilton has a plan. He wants to pay off all the war debt. He wants to raise U.S. revenue, and he wants to create a national bank. He wanted the federal government to also pay off the states' debt from the Revolutionary War. Now, this caused some issues, especially in the South, because the South already paid a lot of the Revolutionary War debt already, and they worked really hard, and they thought, wait a second, you're just going to pay off all the Northern debt just like that, where we, in the South worked really hard to pay that debt off. And so there was conflict there. So they compromised. The Southern states agreed to the federal government to pay off all Revolutionary War debt if the national capital was moved to a southern location, and that's where they chose Washington, D.C., on the banks of the Potomac River. So to raise revenue, Hamilton wanted tariffs, which are taxes on imported goods. Tariffs are good for two things. One, raising money for the government, and encouraging the growth of national business, things that are made right here in the U.S., because tariffs make foreign goods more expensive. So they encourage people to buy U.S. goods. Hamilton also wanted to create a national bank. He said this is, so there's a safe place to keep government money, able to make loans to businesses and government, and we can issue banknotes, paper money that could be used as currency. A lot of times, like during this time, people would just barter or use gold. So Hamilton's plan would give more money to the national government. Thomas Jefferson argued that the bank would it would encourage an unhealthy partnership between the government and wealthy business interests. And Jefferson said that the federal government, does not have a right to create a national bank since it's not listed in the Constitution. So if the Constitution does not say it, we shouldn't be able to do it. And this is a strict interpretation of the Constitution. So Jefferson and Hamilton are butting heads, are not getting along. Hamilton says, well, wait a second, the elastic clause in the Constitution covers whatever is necessary and proper for the government to function. So that's in Article 1, Section 8, number 18. And he sees this as, this says we can do whatever is necessary and proper, and a bank is necessary to run the government. And this is a loose interpretation of the Constitution, which favors greater federal powers. So President Washington sides with Hamilton, and the Bank of the United States was established in 1791. You can pause the video and you can look at your vocabulary. Thanks for tuning in.